Ayana pressed her fingers against the rough scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw. The mirror in the trading post showed the same face she had seen every morning for the past 10 years. The jagged line across her cheek told a story she was tired of explaining, tired of living with, and tired of seeing in people's eyes when they first met her. She was 19 now, old enough that most Apache girls her age were already married with children. But not her. Never her. The trading post was quiet this morning. Mr. Henderson, the white man who ran it, was still asleep in the back room. Ayana had arrived early to organize the shelves and count the supplies. She liked the quiet hours before anyone else showed up. No stares, no whispers. No reminders of what she would never have. The scar had come when she was 9 years old. She remembered that day like it was yesterday, even though she tried not to. Her little brother Koda had wandered too far from camp while picking berries. When the mountain lion appeared, ready to attack the small boy, Ayana had thrown herself between them. The cat's claws had raked across her face before the men came running with their rifles. Everyone said she was a hero. Her parents cried with relief that both children were alive. The medicine man said the spirits had protected them. But as the wound healed, leaving behind a twisted scar that pulled at her skin, the praise faded. What remained was the mark that would define her forever. Her grandmother had been the one to speak the words that haunted her dreams. Old and wise, respected by everyone in the tribe, her grandmother had looked at Ayana's healing face and shaken her head slowly. "The spirits have marked you, child," she had said in Apache, her voice gentle but firm. "No man will ever want a woman touched by such violence. The scar carries bad medicine." At 9, Ayana hadn't understood what those words meant. At 19, she understood perfectly. She watched through the window as other young women from the reservation walked by with their husbands, their children clinging to their skirts. Mary Crowfeather had married last spring. Before that, it was Running Deer and Little Fox. One by one, all the girls Ayana had grown up with had found someone to love them, someone to build a life with, but not her. The men her age looked past her, through her, around her. When they needed someone to translate English or help with paperwork at the agency office, they came to her. Ayana spoke both languages perfectly, could read and write better than most people on the reservation. But when it came to marriage, to love, to being seen as a woman instead of just a useful tool, she might as well have been invisible. The bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Yazzie entered with her twin boys trailing behind her. The older woman smiled at Ayana, but her eyes still flickered to the scar for just a moment. It always happened. Even people who had known her for years still looked. "Good morning, Ayana," Mrs. Yazzie said in Apache. "Mr. Henderson awake yet? I need to trade these baskets for flour." "He'll be out soon," Ayana replied, switching to English so the boys could practice understanding both languages. "Your baskets are beautiful. The patterns are so detailed." Mrs. Yazzie beamed with pride. "My grandmother's design. I'm teaching it to my daughter now so she can make them for her own family someday." The words hit Ayana like a small punch to the chest. Family, children to teach, a legacy to pass down, all the things that felt impossibly out of reach. "That's wonderful," Ayana managed, forcing a smile. After Mrs. Yazzie completed her trade and left with her boys, the morning grew busier. Reservation families came to trade crafts for supplies, and Ayana helped translate and keep the books. She was good at this work. Numbers made sense. Languages had rules. People were more complicated. Around noon, she overheard 2 women talking near the fabric display. They spoke in Apache, probably thinking she couldn't hear them from behind the counter. "Such a shame about Ayana," one said. "She's smart, speaks English so well. Could have been a good wife if not for the scar," the other finished. "My husband says it's a sign. Bad luck to marry someone marked like that." Ayana's hands tightened on the ledger book she was writing in. The pencil lead snapped under the pressure. "But she saved her brother's life," the first woman continued. "Heroic, yes, but who wants a wife who reminds you of violence every time you look at her face?" The women moved on to discussing other gossip, but their words echoed in Ayana's mind. She had heard variations of this conversation many times over the years. Always the same conclusion, always the same judgment. When her shift ended, Ayana walked home along the dusty paths that crisscrossed the reservation. The San Carlos Reservation stretched for miles in every direction, surrounded by desert and distant mountains. It was beautiful in its own way. but it felt small when you had spent your whole life there. Her family's adobe house sat near a small creek that ran year-round. Her mother was grinding corn in the shade of their ramada, the traditional shelter made of poles and brush that provided relief from the Arizona sun. "How was work today?" her mother asked, not looking up from her grinding stone. "Fine. Busy." Her mother studied her face. After 10 years, she could read Ayana's moods like tracks in the sand. "Mrs. Santos came by today," her mother said carefully. "Her nephew from the White Mountain Reservation is visiting. She thought maybe you two could meet." Ayana's stomach twisted. "Mother, please, he's a good man. Works with horses. She says he doesn't mind about, doesn't mind." Ayana's voice rose. "I don't want someone who doesn't mind my face. I want someone who looks at me and sees something beautiful." Her mother's face softened with pain. "Ayana, my daughter, sometimes we must be practical. Love comes in different forms. Not for me, it doesn't." The words came out sharper than she intended. That evening, Ayana sat by the creek as the sun set behind the mountains. The water moved slowly over the rocks, making a gentle sound that usually calmed her. Tonight, even the peaceful creek couldn't quiet the restlessness in her heart. She thought about her grandmother's words again. 10 years of carrying them around like stones in her chest. 10 years of believing that her moment of courage had somehow cursed her to a life alone. The scar pulled tight when she frowned, a constant reminder of the choice she had made that day. Save her brother and accept a lifetime of being unwanted. She would make the same choice again, she knew that. Kota was married now, had 2 children of his own. He was alive and happy because she had acted without thinking. But knowing she had done the right thing didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ayana made a decision. Tomorrow she would ask Mr. Henderson if there was more work she could do. Maybe she could learn to keep books for other businesses in town. Maybe she could save enough money to go somewhere else. Somewhere no one knew her story. Maybe she could find a place where being marked by courage wasn't seen as being marked by bad luck. The creek continued its gentle song as Ayana walked back to the house, her reflection rippling and breaking in the moving water, then slowly coming back together again. 3 days later, Ayana was arranging new bolts of fabric when the door to the trading post swung open with unusual force. A tall man stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She glanced up from her work and immediately noticed 2 things about him. First, he was white, with reddish-brown hair and green eyes. Second, the left side of his face and neck bore the shiny, tight skin of old burn scars. He paused just inside the doorway, blinking as his eyes adjusted from the bright desert sun to the dimmer interior of the store. When his gaze found her behind the counter, something unexpected happened. He looked directly at her face, scar and all, and simply nodded in greeting. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "I'm looking for someone who might help me communicate with folks around here. I need to hire some workers for my ranch." Ayana set down the bolt of blue cotton she had been holding. Most white men who came to the trading post either ignored her completely or stared at her scar with uncomfortable curiosity. This man did neither. "I can help translate," she said carefully. "What kind of work are you offering?" "Cattle work mostly. I've got a spread about 15 miles north of here near the Gila River. Lost most of my hands to better-paying jobs in Tucson, and I need men who know how to work in this climate. Figured Apache folks might be interested." Mr. Henderson emerged from the back room at the sound of voices. "Thomas McKenna," he said, extending his hand to the stranger. "Good to see you back in town. How's the ranch?" So his name was Thomas. Ayana filed that information away as she listened to the 2 men talk. "Struggling, if I'm honest," Thomas replied, shaking Henderson's hand. "Cattle prices are down and I'm short-handed. That's why I'm here." "Miss..." He turned back to Ayana, waiting. "Ayana," she supplied. "Miss Ayana was just offering to help me talk to potential workers. I can pay fair wages, provide meals, and the work isn't harder than what most men around here are used to." Henderson looked skeptical. "Not sure you'll have much luck. Most of the Apache men don't trust working for white ranchers. Too many bad experiences with folks not paying what they promise." Thomas nodded seriously. "I understand that. Had some bad experiences myself with people not keeping their word. That's why I want to be clear up front about what I'm offering and what I expect." Something in his tone made Ayana look at him more closely. There was honesty there, but also a weariness that reminded her of her own feelings. Like he had been disappointed by people before and was tired of it. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Your accent, Ireland, long time ago. Came here as a boy with my family. Been in Arizona territory about 8 years now." His hand unconsciously moved toward the scarred side of his face, then stopped. "Learned the hard way that this country can be unforgiving if you're not prepared for it." Ayanna felt a strange flutter of recognition. Here was someone else marked by hardship. Someone else carrying visible reminders of difficult times. But unlike her, he didn't seem ashamed of his scars. He wore them like facts, neither hiding nor displaying them. "I could put the word out," she offered. "Talk to some of the men. Explain what you're looking for. But Mr. Henderson is right. Most won't be interested." "I appreciate anything you can do," Thomas said, "and I'd be willing to pay you for your time as a translator, whether anyone decides to work for me or not." This surprised her. White folks rarely offered to pay her for translation work, assuming it was just part of her job at the trading post. Over the next 2 hours, several Apache men came and went from the store. Ayanna approached each one, explaining Thomas's offer in detail. The responses were predictably negative. "Work for a white rancher? No, thank you. My cousin worked for a rancher near Phoenix. Never got paid what he was promised. Why should we make some white man rich with our sweat?" Thomas listened to these conversations even though he couldn't understand the Apache words. He seemed to read the negative responses in the men's body language and tone. With each rejection, his shoulders sagged a little more. Finally, around midday, a young Apache man named Joe B. Gay showed some interest. He asked detailed questions about the work, the pay, and the conditions. Thomas answered everything honestly, even admitting that ranch work was hard and sometimes dangerous. "I won't lie to you," Thomas said while Ayanna translated. "I've lost cattle to mountain lions, had horses injured in flash floods, and dealt with rattlesnakes more times than I can count. But I pay every Friday, provide 3 meals a day, and I don't ask anyone to do work I wouldn't do myself." Joe seemed genuinely interested until his older brother arrived and pulled him aside for a heated conversation in Apache. Ayanna couldn't help but overhear. "You're crazy to trust a white man," the brother said. "Remember what happened to our cousin Carlos? Worked 6 weeks and never saw a penny." "This man seems different," Joe replied. "They all seem different at first. Then you're stuck 15 miles from home with no way back and no money in your pocket." Joe's face fell. He turned back to Thomas and shook his head apologetically. "Sorry, mister. Can't take the risk." After Joe left, Thomas stood quietly for a long moment, staring out the window at the dusty street. Ayanna could see the disappointment in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped. "Hard to blame them," he said finally. "If I were in their position, I'd probably feel the same way." Something about his resignation stirred something in Ayanna's chest. Here was a man who seemed decent, who had treated her with respect from the moment he walked in, who was offering honest work for fair pay. And he was being judged not for who he was, but for what other people who looked like him had done. She knew that feeling intimately. "Tell me more about this ranch work," she said impulsively. Thomas turned to look at her, surprised. "You asking for someone else?" "I'm asking for me." The silence that followed was so complete that Ayanna could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the counter. Thomas stared at her and she stared back, her heart pounding with the boldness of what she had just said. "Miss Ayanna," he said slowly, "it's hard physical work. Long days, difficult conditions." "I've worked with cattle before," she interrupted. "My father taught me before he died. I can ride, rope, and I know this land better than most people. I also know both languages, which might be useful if you ever do find other Apache workers." "But," Thomas glanced at Mr. Henderson, who looked equally shocked. "It's not really work for women?" Ayanna finished. "Or for Apache women. Or for scarred Apache women." Thomas had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was going to say it's not work for someone who already has a good job here." "This isn't my job," Ayanna said, gesturing around the trading post. "This is just where I work because there's nowhere else that will have me. But if you're offering real work with real pay, doing something that actually matters, I'm interested." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Not the scar, she realized, but her eyes. He was trying to read her sincerity, her capability, her determination. "Can you handle a horse in rough terrain?" he asked. "Better than most men." "Can you work from sunrise to sunset without complaining?" "I've been doing that here for 3 years." Can you deal with stubborn cattle, unpredictable weather, and the occasional rattlesnake? Ayana touched her scar unconsciously. I think I can handle dangerous situations. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Well then, he said, extending his hand to her, I guess I found my new ranch hand. As Ayana shook his hand, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place in the world where her scars didn't define her worth. The McKenna Ranch sat in a valley where the desert began to give way to grassland, with the Gila River winding through it like a silver ribbon. As Thomas drove the wagon up the dusty path to the main house, Ayana took in everything around her. The cattle looked thin, and many of the fence posts were weathered and leaning. This was clearly a ranch struggling to survive. It's not much to look at right now, Thomas said, noticing her assessment, but the land is good and the water rights are solid. Just needs some work and better management. The ranch house was small but sturdy, built of adobe with a wide porch that provided shade from the desert sun. Behind it stood a barn, a few outbuildings, and a corral where several horses stood in whatever shade they could find. As they approached, two men emerged from the barn. Both were white. Both looked skeptical as they saw Ayana sitting beside Thomas on the wagon seat. Thomas, the older of the two called out, his voice carrying a warning tone. What's this about? Pete, Charlie. Thomas nodded to each man. This is Ayana. She's going to be working with us. Pete, a grizzled man in his 50s with silver hair and suspicious eyes, looked Ayana up and down. You hired a squaw? The word hit Ayana like a slap, but she kept her face calm. She had heard worse. I hired someone who knows cattle and horses, Thomas replied firmly, and I'd appreciate it if you kept your opinions to yourself unless they're about the work. Charlie, younger but equally unfriendly, spat into the dust. This is crazy, Thomas. What's she going to do when the real work starts? Cry and run home to the reservation? Why don't we find out? Ayana said quietly, climbing down from the wagon without waiting for help. Which horse can I use? The question seemed to surprise them. Pete jerked his thumb toward the corral. The bay mare, I guess. But she's got a mean streak. Ayana walked to the corral and studied the horses. The bay mare Pete had pointed out was indeed difficult looking, with ears pinned back in an aggressive stance. But there was another horse that caught her attention, a black gelding standing apart from the others, favoring his left front hoof. What's wrong with the black one? She asked. Stone bruise, Charlie said. Been lame for a week. Probably have to put him down if he doesn't get better soon. Without asking permission, Ayana climbed over the corral fence and approached the injured horse. He shied away at first, but she spoke to him in Apache, her voice low and soothing. Slowly, he allowed her to get close enough to examine his hoof. He's got a stone wedged in the frog, she called over to the men. It's infected, but not too badly. Pete, do you have a hoof pick and some salt water? Pete looked at Thomas, who nodded. Reluctantly, Pete brought the requested items. Ayana worked carefully, talking to the horse the entire time. When she finally pried out the embedded stone, the horse whinnied with what sounded like relief. Clean this twice a day with salt water, she told Pete, washing the infection out of the hoof. Keep him in the corral for 3 more days, then he'll be fine to work. Thomas had been watching the entire time. Where did you learn to do that? My father, Ayana said simply. He said horses will tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen. Over the next several hours, Thomas showed Ayana around the ranch. She noticed everything, which pastures had the best grass, where the fencing needed repair, which cattle looked sick or malnourished. But most importantly, she saw the potential that Thomas had seen when he bought this place. The problem isn't the land, she told him as they rode back toward the house. It's the water distribution. You've got good water from the river, but it's not reaching the far pastures efficiently. I know. Thomas sighed. I've been trying to figure out how to extend the irrigation, but it's expensive and I'm not sure it would work anyway. Ayana was quiet for a moment, thinking. What if you didn't extend the irrigation? What if you brought the water to where you need it? She explained an Apache technique her grandfather had taught her, a system of small channels and retention pools that could capture and direct seasonal rainfall, supplementing the river water without requiring expensive equipment. It takes some digging, she said, but it works with the natural flow of the land instead of fighting against it. Thomas listened intently, asking questions and clearly impressed by her knowledge. You think it would work here? I know it would. Apache people have been managing water in this desert for hundreds of years. That evening around the dinner table, the atmosphere was tense. Pete had cooked beans and cornbread, and the four of them ate mostly in silence. Ayanna could feel the hostility from Pete and Charlie like heat from a fire. So, Charlie said finally, where exactly is she going to sleep? The bunkhouse ain't set up for her kind. There's a small room off the kitchen, Thomas said calmly. It's got a window and a good door. Should be comfortable enough. This is a mistake, Thomas, Pete said bluntly. Hiring Indians never ends well. They'll steal you blind and disappear in the night. Ayanna set down her fork carefully. Mr. Pete, I understand you don't trust me. You don't know me. And you've probably heard bad stories about Apache people. But I'm here to work and I plan to earn my pay honestly. If you give me a chance, I think you'll find I'm more useful than you expect. Pete snorted. We'll see about that. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn to find Ayanna already in the barn, checking on the injured black horse. She had brought fresh water and was cleaning his hoof as she had promised. How's he doing? Thomas asked. Much better. The swelling is down and the infection is clearing up. He'll be ready to work in a couple of days. They spent the morning moving cattle from an overgrazed pasture to one with better grass. Ayanna proved she hadn't been boasting about her riding skills. She handled her horse with easy confidence and seemed to anticipate what the cattle would do before they did it. Your father taught you well, Thomas commented as they paused to rest the horses. He said understanding animals was like understanding people, Ayanna replied. You have to pay attention to what they're really telling you, not just what you want to hear. Around midday, they encountered a problem that had been plaguing the ranch for weeks. A group of about 20 cattle had wandered into a maze of rocky canyons and refused to come out. Pete and Charlie had tried multiple times to drive them back to the main herd, but the cattle always scattered deeper into the rocks. We might have to leave them, Thomas said, studying the terrain. It's too dangerous to chase them in there with horses. Ayanna dismounted and studied the canyon entrance. Give me an hour, she said. Ayanna, it's not safe. Those cattle are spooked and the footing is treacherous. Trust me, she said simply. She disappeared into the canyon on foot, moving quietly and staying low. Thomas waited anxiously, listening for sounds of trouble. After what seemed like much longer than an hour, he heard cattle moving, then saw them emerging from the canyon in a calm, organized group. Ayanna walked behind them, not driving them, but somehow guiding them back toward the main herd. How did you do that? Thomas asked when she rejoined him. Apache hunting technique, she explained. You don't chase the animal where it doesn't want to go. You make it think going where you want was its own idea. That afternoon brought an even bigger test. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain, and the cattle grew restless. Thomas was checking the fence line when he heard Ayanna shout a warning. A rattlesnake had spooked his horse, causing it to rear and throw him hard against a fence post. Thomas lay stunned, his left arm clearly broken as the snake coiled nearby, ready to strike again. Ayanna didn't hesitate. She grabbed a long stick from the ground and positioned herself between Thomas and the snake, moving with careful precision. She didn't kill the snake. Instead, she encouraged it to retreat under a nearby rock outcropping, away from both of them. Don't move your arm, she told Thomas, kneeling beside him. I think it's broken, but not too badly. She fashioned a makeshift sling from her belt and helped him back onto his horse, leading both animals back to the ranch house. Pete and Charlie were shocked to see their boss injured and being cared for by the woman they had dismissed. What happened? Pete demanded. Rattlesnake spooked my horse, Thomas explained, his face pale with pain. Ayanna probably saved my life. That evening, as Ayanna helped set Thomas's arm properly and prepare a poultice to reduce swelling, Pete approached her quietly. I owe you an apology, he said gruffly. You proved yourself today. Thomas is lucky to have you here. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Ayanna settled into her small room that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being valued for her abilities rather than judged for her appearance. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the desert and the gentle lowing of cattle. For the first time since leaving the reservation, she felt like she might be exactly where she belonged. 6 weeks had passed since Ayanna started working at the McKenna Ranch, and the changes were impossible to ignore. The black horse she had healed was now Thomas's favorite mount. The water management system she had designed was bringing life to previously barren pastures. Even Pete and Charlie had grudgingly admitted she knew what she was doing, but success at the ranch came with a price that grew heavier each day. When Ayanna returned to the reservation on Sundays to visit her family, the reception grew colder each week. Women who had known her since childhood now whispered when she passed. Men who had once greeted her warmly now looked away. The change was subtle but unmistakable. This particular Sunday, as she walked toward her family's house, Mrs. Yazzie approached her with unusual directness. "Ayanna," the older woman said, her voice carrying disappointment. "People are talking." "They always talk, Mrs. Yazzie. What are they saying now?" "They're saying you've forgotten who you are, that you spend your days with white men, following their ways, abandoning your people." Ayanna felt a familiar twist in her stomach. "I'm working, earning money, learning skills that could help our people if anyone was interested in listening. But at what cost?" Mrs. Yazzie's eyes were sad rather than angry. "You're becoming something that doesn't belong anywhere. Not white, not truly Apache anymore. What happens when this job ends? Where will you fit then?" The conversation stayed with Ayanna as she rode back to the ranch that evening. Where did she belong? At the reservation, she was increasingly seen as a traitor to her heritage. But she could never truly be part of the white world either. She existed somewhere in between, useful to both but fully accepted by neither. Meanwhile, in the town of Riverside, 15 miles south of the ranch, different conversations were taking place. At Murphy's Saloon, a group of local ranchers gathered every Friday evening to drink and complain about their various problems. Lately, Thomas McKenna had become a frequent topic of discussion. "It's not natural," declared Bill Morrison, who owned the largest spread in the area, a white man working alongside a savage girl like she's his equal. "Sets a bad example for the other Indians. Heard she's living right there on his property," added Frank Tucker, nursing his whiskey. "What's to stop other Apache from thinking they can just move in wherever they please?" The conversations grew more heated each week, fueled by whiskey and prejudice. Some men talked about the good old days when Indians knew their place. Others worried about property values and safety. All of them agreed that Thomas McKenna was making a dangerous mistake. The tension finally erupted on a hot Tuesday morning when Thomas and Ayanna rode into Riverside to buy supplies. They needed fencing materials and medical supplies for the cattle, purchases that required visiting multiple stores. At the hardware store, the owner served them reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with Ayanna's presence. Other customers stared openly, some whispering to each other. Thomas ignored the hostile atmosphere, but Ayanna felt every suspicious look like a weight on her shoulders. Things got worse at the general store. As they waited in line to pay for their purchases, a well-dressed woman with graying hair turned to face them. "Excuse me," she said to Thomas in a voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Are you Thomas McKenna?" "I am," Thomas replied carefully. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, president of the Riverside Ladies Auxiliary. We've been hearing troubling reports about your employment practices." "I'm not sure what you mean." Mrs. Patterson's gaze flicked to Ayanna with obvious distaste. "Surely you understand how inappropriate it is for a Christian man to have an unmarried Indian woman living on his property. The implications are scandalous." Thomas's face flushed red, but his voice remained steady. "Miss Ayanna is an employee, nothing more. She's a skilled ranch hand who earns her wages honestly." "Ranch hand?" Mrs. Patterson's voice rose with incredulous laughter. "That creature is no more a ranch hand than my poodle is a horse. This is exactly the kind of degraded behavior that leads to trouble with the Indians. You're encouraging them to forget their place." The store had gone completely quiet. Every person in the room was listening, waiting to see what would happen. Ayanna felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing anger in these situations only made things worse. Thomas, however, had no such restraint. "Ma'am," he said, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced as his temper rose. "I don't know what kind of trouble you're referring to, but I can tell you that Miss Ayanna has more skill, intelligence, and character than most men I've worked with. If that threatens you somehow, perhaps you should examine why." Mrs. Patterson gasped as if he had struck her. "How dare you?" "I'm only thinking of your reputation and the safety of decent folk. Everyone knows what happens when you treat Indians as equals. They become violent and ungrateful." "The only violence I've seen lately," Thomas replied coldly, "is in the minds of people who judge others based on the color of their skin. rather than the content of their character. He paid for their purchases quickly and guided Ayanna toward the door. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. "Mark my words, Mr. McKenna," she called after them. "No good will come of this arrangement. You're playing with fire, and when you get burned, don't expect sympathy from respectable people." The ride back to the ranch was tense and quiet. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I'm sorry you had to endure that." "It's not your fault," Ayanna replied, though her voice was tight with emotion. "I've heard worse. That doesn't make it right." They rode in silence for another mile before Ayanna spoke again. "Maybe she has a point, though. Maybe this arrangement is causing more trouble than it's worth." Thomas reined in his horse and turned to look at her directly. "Are you thinking of quitting?" "I'm thinking about what's best for everyone. The ranch is doing well now. Pete and Charlie can handle the work. You don't really need me anymore." "But I do need you," Thomas said, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "Not just for the ranch work, though you're the best hand I've ever had. You make me think about things differently. You see solutions where I only see problems. He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "You make this place feel less lonely." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address directly. That evening, the tension followed them home. Pete mentioned that he'd heard talk in town about trouble brewing over Thomas's hiring practices. Charlie reported that some of the neighboring ranchers had stopped being friendly when they met him on the range. "Maybe it's time to be more careful," Pete suggested. "Keep Ayanna working closer to home, away from the public eye." "I won't hide her away like she's something to be ashamed of," Thomas said firmly. "She's part of this operation and she deserves the same respect as any other worker." But late that night, as Ayanna lay in her small room listening to the desert wind, she wondered if respect was worth the growing hostility that seemed to follow wherever she went. At the reservation, she was seen as a betrayer of her people. In town, she was viewed as a threat to the natural order. And here at the ranch, her presence was creating problems for a man who had shown her nothing but fairness and kindness. The next morning brought a new challenge. 3 Apache men from the reservation rode up to the ranch house, their faces grim and purposeful. Ayanna recognized them immediately, her cousin Robert and 2 tribal council members. "Ayanna," Robert called out in Apache, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, but Thomas could read the tension in every gesture and voice. The men spoke urgently, gesturing toward the ranch house and then back toward the reservation. Ayanna's responses became increasingly heated. Finally, the 3 men mounted their horses and rode away without acknowledging Thomas's presence. "What was that about?" Thomas asked. Ayanna's face was troubled. "The tribal council is getting pressure from the Indian agent. He's heard complaints from townspeople about me working here. They want me to come back to the reservation and take a job in the agency office. And if you refuse, they might revoke my travel pass. Without it, I can't legally leave the reservation." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They can do that?" "The Indian agent has a lot of power over our lives. If enough white people complain that I'm causing trouble." She shrugged. But Thomas could see the fear in her eyes. For the first time since Ayanna had started working at the ranch, Thomas truly understood the precarious nature of her situation. She wasn't just an employee who could quit if things got difficult. She was caught between 2 worlds, both of which seemed determined to control her choices. As he watched her walk toward the corral to begin her daily tasks, Thomas realized that their working relationship had become something much more complicated, and much more dangerous for both of them. The threat from the tribal council hung over the ranch like storm clouds for the next 2 weeks. Ayanna continued her work, but Thomas noticed she had grown quieter, more watchful. She jumped at unexpected sounds and seemed to be listening for horses approaching, even when they were working far from the main house. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in late September. Thomas had ridden to town early to meet with the banker about extending his loan. The cattle were thriving under Ayanna's management techniques, and he had hoped to negotiate better terms based on the ranch's improved prospects. Instead, he walked into a trap. The banker, Mr. Whitmore, was not alone in his office. Mrs. Patterson sat in one of the chairs facing the desk, along with Bill Morrison and the town's Indian agent, a thin man named Crawley who always smelled of tobacco and cheap whiskey. "Mr. McKenna," Whitmore said without getting up. Please sit down. We need to discuss your loan situation. Thomas remained standing. I thought we were meeting privately. These folks have some concerns that directly affect your ability to repay this bank, Whitmore replied. I think it's best we address them together. Agent Crawley leaned forward, his narrow face pinched with disapproval. McKenna, I've been getting complaints about one of my Indians working on your ranch. The girl, Ayanna. People are saying she's living out there unsupervised, which violates the terms of her travel pass. She lives in a separate room and earns her wages through honest work. Thomas said carefully. That's not how decent people see it, Mrs. Patterson interjected. A young, unmarried woman living alone with men? It's scandalous. And setting a terrible example for other Indians who might get ideas above their station. Bill Morrison nodded gravely. It's causing unrest, Thomas. Other ranchers are worried their Indian workers might start demanding the same treatment. We can't have that. Thomas looked around the room, finally understanding what was happening. This isn't about my loan at all, is it? Whitmore had the decency to look uncomfortable. Your financial situation is solid, I'll grant you that. But this bank serves the whole community, and the whole community is concerned about your employment choices. Here's what's going to happen, Agent Crawley said, pulling out an official-looking document. I'm revoking the girl's travel pass effective immediately. She'll return to the reservation today and take a position in my office where she can be properly supervised. And if she refuses, Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer, then she'll be arrested for violation of federal Indian regulations and sent to a government school back east. Permanently. The room fell silent. Thomas stared at the document in Crawley's hands, his mind racing. They had cornered him completely. Refuse and Ayanna would be destroyed. Except, and he would lose not only the best ranch hand he'd ever had, but something much more precious that he was only beginning to understand. I need time to discuss this with her, Thomas said finally. No time needed, Crawley replied. I'm riding out to your place this afternoon to collect her. Thomas rode back to the ranch with his heart pounding and his mind spinning with desperate possibilities. When he arrived, he found Ayanna working in the corral with a young horse that had been giving everyone trouble. She had the animal calm and responding to her commands, another small miracle that would be lost when she left. Ayanna, he called. We need to talk. Something in his tone must have warned her. She secured the horse and walked over, her face already showing concern. What happened in town? Thomas told her everything. About the meeting, the ultimatum, Agent Crawley's plans to come for her that afternoon. With each word, he watched her face grow more resigned, more defeated. I knew this would happen eventually, she said quietly when he finished. I should have gone back to the reservation weeks ago. There might be another way, Thomas said, the words coming out before he had fully formed the thought. What do you mean? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them. One way or another, marry me. The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Ayanna stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she didn't understand. What did you say? Marry me, he repeated, his voice stronger now. If you're my wife, Crawley can't touch you. The travel pass becomes irrelevant. You'd have the legal protection of marriage. Ayanna's face went through a series of expressions, shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like anger. You want to marry me out of pity? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. No, Thomas said quickly, not pity. I want to marry you because... He struggled to find words for feelings he had been trying to ignore. Because these past few months have been the happiest I've had since my wife died. Because you make me laugh. Because you see possibilities where others see only problems. Because when I think about losing you, it feels like someone is squeezing my heart with a fist. Ayanna shook her head, backing away from him. Thomas, you don't understand what you're saying. Marriage to me would destroy your reputation completely. You'd lose everything, the respect of your neighbors, your business relationships, maybe even the ranch. I don't care about any of that. Well, I do. The words came out sharper than she intended. I care because I've seen what happens when people make sacrifices they think are noble. They end up resenting the person they sacrificed for. And I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for. Thomas stepped closer, his green eyes intense. What if it's not a sacrifice? What if marrying you is exactly what I want, regardless of Crawley's threats? You can't mean that, can I? Thomas reached up and touched his own scarred face. Do you think any respectable woman in Riverside would want to marry me? Do you think I haven't heard the whispers about my appearance, my accent, my Irish Catholic background? We're both outcasts, Ayanna. The difference is I stopped caring what small-minded people think. Ayanna felt tears stinging her eyes. This is crazy, Thomas. People will say you only married me to save me from the Indian agent. They'll never believe it's real. I don't care what they believe. I care what you believe. The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the dust, they could see 4 riders coming up the ranch road. Agent Crawley and 3 men who looked like hired guns rather than government officials. He's early, Thomas muttered grimly. Ayanna straightened her shoulders, preparing to face whatever came next. I should go pack my things. Thomas caught her arm gently. You don't have to go with him. You can choose differently. By marrying you, by ruining your life, by trusting me when I say my life would be ruined without you in it. The riders were close enough now that individual faces could be seen. Agent Crawley rode in front, his expression smug and self-satisfied. The 3 men with him had their hands resting casually on their gun belts. Last chance, Ayanna, Thomas said urgently. Will you marry me? She looked at his scarred face, at the hope and determination in his eyes, at the approaching riders who represented everything that had always limited her choices. For her entire adult life, she had been told what she could and couldn't do, where she could and couldn't go, who she could and couldn't be. Maybe it was time to make a choice based on what she wanted instead of what others expected. Yes, she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. But Thomas, she gripped his hand tightly. Are you absolutely sure about this? Because once we do this, there's no going back. Thomas squeezed her hand in return, a smile spreading across his face despite the approaching confrontation. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Agent Crawley reined in his horse just outside the ranch house, his 3 companions spreading out in a loose semicircle. McKenna, he called. I'm here for the Indian girl. Send her out. Thomas and Ayanna walked out to meet them standing side by side. Thomas could feel the tension radiating from Ayanna, but her face showed nothing but calm determination. Agent Crawley, Thomas said pleasantly, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. I have legal authority to take this girl back to the reservation. Actually, Thomas replied, reaching into his vest pocket. You don't. He pulled out a folded document and held it up. It was their marriage certificate from 2 years ago. His first marriage certificate. But Agent Crawley wouldn't know that. As of this morning, Miss Ayanna became Mrs. McKenna. Your authority over her ended the moment she said, I do. The bluff was outrageous, but Thomas delivered it with such confidence that Crawley actually looked uncertain. That's impossible. There's been no wedding announced, no ceremony. Private ceremony, Thomas said smoothly. Justice of the Peace Hendricks performed it at dawn. All perfectly legal. Ayanna stared at Thomas in amazement. He was lying with such conviction that she almost believed it herself. Crawley's face darkened with suspicion, but he seemed unsure of his legal ground. After a long, tense moment, he wheeled his horse around. This isn't over, McKenna, he snarled. I'll be checking on this story. If you're lying, then you'll know where to find us, Thomas replied calmly. They watched the riders disappear down the road before either of them spoke. Thomas, Ayanna said finally, we're not actually married. Not yet, he agreed. Justice of the Peace Hendricks lived in a small adobe house on the outskirts of Riverside, surrounded by a garden that his wife tended with loving care. When Thomas and Ayanna arrived at his door that evening, the elderly man took one look at their faces and invited them inside without question. Thomas, my boy, Hendricks said in his gentle voice, you look like a man with something urgent on his mind. We need to get married. Judge tonight, if possible. Hendricks raised his eyebrows but didn't seem shocked. After 30 years of frontier justice, he had seen stranger things. His gaze moved to Ayanna, taking in her Apache features and work-worn clothes. Miss, I need to ask, are you entering this marriage of your own free will? I am, Ayanna replied firmly. And you understand that marriage is a serious commitment, not something to be entered into lightly. Thomas and Ayanna looked at each other. In that moment, both realized they were about to cross a line that would change their lives forever. But neither wavered. We understand, Thomas said. Mrs. Hendricks appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had helped deliver half the babies in the county. Oh my, she said. looking at Ayana's travel-stained clothes and Thomas's dusty appearance. "We can't have a wedding like this. Come with me, dear." Before Ayana could protest, Mrs. Hendricks had whisked her away to the back bedroom. 20 minutes later, she emerged wearing a simple but beautiful white dress that Mrs. Hendricks had altered quickly to fit. "It was my daughter's," the older woman explained, pinning a few late-blooming desert flowers in Ayana's dark hair. "She'd be honored to have it worn by a bride as lovely as you." Thomas felt his breath catch when he saw her. In the lamplight, with the white dress and flowers in her hair, Ayana looked radiant. The scar on her face seemed less prominent, overshadowed by the glow of happiness and determination in her eyes. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Judge Hendricks spoke about the serious nature of marriage, about commitment and partnership through good times and difficult ones. When he asked if they would honor and protect each other, both Thomas and Ayana answered with conviction. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Hendricks said solemnly. "Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and brief, but it sealed a promise that both knew would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Mrs. Hendricks insisted on serving cake and coffee to celebrate, and for a brief hour, it felt like a normal wedding between two people who loved each other. But as they prepared to leave, Judge Hendricks pulled Thomas aside. "Son, I hope you know what you're doing," he said quietly. "There are going to be people who won't accept this marriage, who'll try to make trouble for both of you." "I know," Thomas replied. "But some things are worth fighting for." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought about what they had just done. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were married now, but what did that really mean? How would they navigate this new relationship that had grown out of necessity, but was rooted in genuine affection? "Thomas," Ayana said as they approached the ranch house, "what happens now?" "Now we figure it out as we go along," he replied. "Just like everything else we've done together." The next morning brought their first test. Pete and Charlie were waiting by the corral when Thomas and Ayana emerged from the house together, and the change in their relationship was immediately obvious. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said, staring at them. "You two got hitched?" "Last night," Thomas confirmed. Judge Hendricks performed the ceremony. Charlie whistled low. "That's going to stir up a hornet's nest in town." He wasn't wrong. By noon, 3 different neighbors had ridden over with various excuses to visit, all clearly hoping to confirm the rumors they had already heard. Mrs. Patterson arrived in the afternoon with 2 other women from the ladies' auxiliary, ostensibly to bring a wedding gift. "How thoughtful of you to let us know about the ceremony," Mrs. Patterson said with false sweetness, setting a small package on the kitchen table. "We would have loved to attend." "It was a private ceremony," Thomas replied evenly. "I'm sure it was." Her gaze moved to Ayana, who was preparing coffee with quiet dignity. "I do hope you'll be very happy together, though I must say this marriage will certainly change things in the community." "What do you mean by that?" Ayana asked, speaking for the first time since the women arrived. Mrs. Patterson smiled coldly. "Well, dear, surely you understand that there are certain social expectations. Church attendance, community involvement, proper behavior. I'm afraid you'll find that being married to a white man doesn't automatically grant you acceptance in respectable society." "I never expected it would," Ayana replied calmly, "but I did expect basic courtesy, which seems to be in short supply." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Mrs. Patterson's companions looked shocked that Ayana had spoken so directly to their leader. "I see," Mrs. Patterson said icily. "Well, I suppose we'll all have to adjust our expectations, won't we?" After the women left, Thomas found Ayana standing on the porch staring out at the desert. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," she said, "but I'm starting to understand what we're really up against." The challenges came from multiple directions over the following weeks. In town, some merchants became reluctant to serve them, while others charged higher prices. The bank began asking more questions about the ranch's finances. Several of Thomas's former customers found excuses to take their business elsewhere. But the pressure from the white community was nothing compared to the reaction from the Apache reservation. When news of the marriage reached Ayana's family, her mother came to visit with tears in her eyes. "My daughter," she said in Apache, "what have you done?" The conversation that followed was painful for both women. Ayana's mother couldn't understand why she had chosen to marry outside their people. especially a white man who could never truly understand Apache ways. You were already living between two worlds, her mother said sadly. Now you belong to neither. Maybe I'm creating a third world, Ayana replied. Maybe that's what some of us are meant to do. Her mother left without blessing the marriage, and that night Ayana cried for the first time since the wedding. Thomas held her while she grieved for the family relationships that might never be repaired. The situation grew more serious when Agent Crawley returned with a federal marshal, determined to challenge the validity of their marriage. They demanded to see official documentation, questioned Judge Hendricks extensively, and made it clear they were looking for any excuse to separate the couple. This marriage seems awfully convenient, the marshal observed. Girl about to be arrested, sudden wedding ceremony. Makes a man suspicious. The timing was coincidental, Thomas lied smoothly. We had been planning to marry for weeks. Can anyone verify that? Pete stepped forward unexpectedly. I can. Thomas talked about marrying Ayana more than once. Said he was just waiting for the right time to ask her. Charlie nodded in agreement, backing up Pete's story. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for his ranch hands, who were risking their own reputations to protect his marriage. The marshal wasn't entirely convinced, but without proof of fraud, there was nothing he could do. The marriage was legal, and Ayana was now protected by her new status as a white man's wife. But protection came with its own price. Late one night, someone shot several of their cattle and left a note nailed to the ranch house door. Send the squaw back where she belongs or face the consequences. Thomas found the note when he went out for his morning chores. He stood staring at it for a long moment, feeling anger build in his chest. When Ayana joined him, he tried to hide the paper, but she saw it before he could. They're trying to scare us, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Are you scared? Thomas asked. Ayana considered the question seriously. Yes, she said finally, but not enough to give up what we're building here. Over the following days, they took precautions. Pete and Charlie began taking turns staying awake at night to watch for intruders. Thomas taught Ayana to use the rifle he kept by the door. They moved the horses closer to the house and reinforced the locks on all the buildings. The harassment continued sporadically. Fences cut, water troughs poisoned, mysterious fires that had to be quickly extinguished. But through it all, Thomas and Ayana grew closer as they faced each challenge together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas reached for Ayana's hand. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Marrying me. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had changed in their lives. The hostility they faced, the isolation from their respective communities, the constant vigilance required to protect what they had built. Ask me that question in a year, she said finally, when we know whether love is strong enough to overcome everything else. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. I already know the answer to that. As if in response to his words, a coyote called from somewhere in the desert, its voice carrying across the evening air. Another answered from a different direction, then another. Soon the night was filled with their wild song, a reminder that some creatures were meant to live on the edges of civilization, finding their own way despite the dangers. Winter came early and harsh to the Arizona territory that year. By November, snow had already dusted the higher elevations and the temperatures dropped far below what was normal for the region. The cattle huddled together in whatever shelter they could find, and keeping them fed became a daily struggle. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, watching ice form on the water troughs for the third morning in a row. Behind him, Ayana was fighting a wave of nausea that had become her unwelcome companion over the past 2 weeks. The cattle in the north pasture are looking thin, Thomas said, not noticing her distress. I think we'll have to move them closer to the hay stores. Ayana gripped the edge of the table, willing her stomach to settle. She had been trying to ignore the signs, hoping they meant something else, but this morning there was no doubt left in her mind. Thomas, she said quietly, we need to talk. Something in her tone made him turn around immediately. When he saw her pale face and the way she was holding herself, alarm flashed across his features. Are you sick? You've been looking tired lately. I'm not sick, Ayana said, taking a deep breath. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Thomas stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and then something that looked like fear. Pregnant? He repeated. You're sure? As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there. Thomas crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her gently as if she might break. "This is wonderful news," he said, but she could hear the worry underlying his joy. And he was right to worry. Within days of Ayanna beginning to show the subtle signs of early pregnancy, word somehow spread through both communities. The reaction was swift and ugly. At the reservation, the tribal council called an emergency meeting. Ayanna's cousin Robert rode out to the ranch with a message that was both invitation and ultimatum. "The elders want to see you," he told her, his face grave. "They're saying the child you carry is an abomination, a mixing that goes against the natural order." "And what do you say?" Ayanna asked. Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I say you're my cousin, and I've always respected your strength. But this is bigger than just you and Thomas now. This child will belong to both worlds and neither. What kind of life is that?" In town, the reaction was even more hostile. Mrs. Patterson organized what she called a community meeting at the church, where dozens of residents gathered to discuss the Indian problem. Thomas learned about the meeting from Judge Hendricks, who had attended out of concern for their safety. "They're talking about boycotting any business that serves you," Hendricks warned. "Some of the younger men are using words like abomination and mongrel child. Thomas, I'm worried they might try to take direct action." The pressure was immediate and crushing. The general store refused to sell them supplies. The bank called in their loan early, demanding full payment within 30 days. Even Pete and Charlie began to show strain, as their own families faced harassment for associating with the McKennas. "Maybe I should go back to the reservation until the baby comes," Ayanna suggested one evening as they counted their dwindling money. "Just temporarily to take the pressure off you." "No," Thomas said firmly. "We face this together or not at all." But as the weeks passed, the isolation became almost unbearable. They were forced to travel 50 miles to find merchants willing to sell them food and supplies. The ranch's cattle were mysteriously sickened twice, requiring expensive treatment they could barely afford. Most painful of all, Ayanna's own family stopped visiting, leaving her completely cut off from her Apache heritage just when she needed support most. The breaking point came on a bitter cold night in January. Ayanna was 4 months pregnant now, her condition obvious to anyone who looked closely. She had been having trouble sleeping, worried about money, worried about the baby, worried about the toll this was taking on Thomas. She was in the kitchen making tea when she heard horses approaching fast, multiple riders moving with purpose rather than casual visit. Thomas heard them too and reached for the rifle they now kept loaded by the door. "Stay inside," he told her, but Ayanna moved to the window where she could see what was happening. 6 men sat on horseback in front of the house, all wearing bandanas over their faces. In the moonlight, she could see they carried torches and guns. "McKenna!" one of them shouted. "Come out here." Thomas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. "What do you want?" "We want you to send that Indian wife of yours back where she belongs. This community won't stand for the mixed breed spawn you're bringing into the world. My wife and child are none of your business," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the odds against him. "Everything that threatens decent white families is our business," another rider called out. "Last warning, McKenna. Send her away or we'll do it for you." "Over my dead body," the leader of the group laughed harshly. "That can be arranged." What happened next unfolded with terrible speed. The riders spurred their horses forward, planning to rush the house and force their way inside. Thomas raised his rifle, knowing he couldn't stop them all but determined to protect Ayanna as long as possible. But he had forgotten about Pete and Charlie. The 2 ranch hands had been sleeping in the bunkhouse when the riders arrived. While the confrontation played out in front of the house, they had quietly positioned themselves in the shadows with their own weapons. When the riders charged, Pete and Charlie opened fire from the sides, creating confusion and panic among the attackers. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted contradictory orders, and in the chaos, 2 of the riders were thrown to the ground. Thomas used the distraction to devastating effect, putting a bullet through the shoulder of the leader and sending the others scrambling for cover behind whatever shelter they could find. The gunfight that followed lasted only minutes, but felt like hours. When it ended, one of the attackers lay dead. 2 others were wounded, and the rest had fled into the night. Thomas had taken a bullet in his left leg and was bleeding heavily onto the porch floor. Ayanna ran to him despite his earlier orders to stay inside, pressing cloth against his wound to slow the bleeding. How bad is it? She asked, her voice surprisingly calm. Bad enough, Thomas replied through gritted teeth. But I'll live. Pete and Charlie helped get him inside and onto the kitchen table where Ayanna could work on the wound by lamplight. The bullet had gone clean through his thigh, missing the major blood vessels but leaving a ragged hole that would be slow to heal. We need to get you to a doctor, Ayanna said as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. Can't risk it, Thomas replied. If we go to town now, they might arrest us for killing that man. Self-defense or not, we're not going to get a fair hearing. They were trapped. Thomas was wounded and needed medical care they couldn't safely seek. The ranch was under siege from hostile neighbors who wouldn't hesitate to attack again. And Ayanna was pregnant with a child that half the world seemed to consider an abomination. For the first time since their marriage, despair settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. Maybe we should leave, Ayanna said quietly as she finished tending Thomas's wound. Pack what we can and head west to California. Start over somewhere nobody knows us. Thomas looked at her with pain-glazed eyes. With what money? And how far do you think we'd get with me wounded and you pregnant? It was Pete who provided the answer they hadn't considered. My brother lives up in Colorado, he said. Runs a trading post near Denver. Different kind of country up there. More tolerant of mixed marriages. He'd give you work and a place to stay until the baby comes and Thomas heals up. We can't ask you to risk that, Ayanna said. You ain't asking. I'm offering. Pete's weathered face was grim but determined. I've seen a lot of unfairness in my time, but what happened tonight crossed a line. Nobody should have to face down a mob for the crime of loving someone. Charlie nodded agreement. Pete's right. This ain't about Indian and white anymore. This is about decent people standing up to bullies. Over the following days, as Thomas fought fever from his infected wound and Ayanna struggled with pregnancy complications brought on by stress, they made their plans. Pete would travel north to contact his brother. Charlie would stay to watch the ranch and tend the cattle as best he could. When Thomas was strong enough to travel, they would make their escape to Colorado. But even as they planned, Ayanna wondered if running away was the answer. Would they spend their entire lives fleeing from one hostile community to another? Would their child grow up always looking over their shoulder, never knowing the security of belonging somewhere? Late one night, as Thomas slept fitfully beside her, Ayanna placed her hands on her growing belly and spoke to the child growing there. I don't know what kind of world we're bringing you into, she whispered, but I promise you this, you will be loved. No matter what anyone else says about you, no matter how difficult things become, you will always be wanted and cherished. Outside, the winter wind howled across the desert, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. But inside the small ranch house, 3 people who had chosen to stand together continued to plan for a future that was uncertain, but not without hope. The test of their love was far from over, but they had survived the first assault. Spring came late to Arizona that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal that Thomas and Ayanna desperately needed. Thomas's leg had healed well enough for him to walk without a cane, though he still limped on cold mornings. Ayanna was 7 months pregnant now, her belly round and prominent, the baby active enough to keep her awake at night with its constant movement. They had decided against fleeing to Colorado. The decision came after weeks of discussion and one pivotal conversation with an unexpected visitor. Judge Hendricks had ridden out to the ranch on a warm March morning, bringing news from town and a proposal that surprised them both. There's been a change in the wind, he told them as they sat on the porch drinking coffee. That man who died in the attack on your ranch? Turns out he was wanted for murder in 3 different territories. When his identity became known, people started asking questions about the others who rode with him. The investigation had revealed a network of men who had been terrorizing Mexican and Apache families throughout the region, using fear of racial mixing as cover for their criminal activities. Several prominent townspeople who had supported their cause quietly distanced themselves when the truth came out. More importantly, Hendricks continued, there's a new territorial governor, and he's made it clear that he won't tolerate vigilante violence against legally married couples, regardless of their race. The legal protection was important, but what mattered more to Thomas and Ayanna was the gradual change in attitude from some of their neighbors. Pete's cousin, a rancher named Wilson, had stopped by to ask about Ayanna's water management techniques. Mrs. Santos from the reservation had brought herbs to help with Ayanna's pregnancy, defying tribal disapproval to maintain their friendship. Maybe running away isn't the answer, Thomas had said after Hendricks left. Maybe the answer is staying and proving that love doesn't recognize the boundaries other people want to draw. Are you sure? Ayanna had asked. It's not going to be easy for our child growing up here. It won't be easy anywhere, Thomas replied. But at least here we've already started building something. We've got allies, we've got a working ranch, and we've proven we can survive the worst they can throw at us. The decision to stay was tested when Ayanna went into labor on a stormy night in early May. The nearest doctor was 30 miles away, and the roads were washed out from recent rains. Thomas sent Charlie racing through the mud to fetch the midwife from the reservation, while Pete rode in the opposite direction to find any medical help he could. For 6 hours, Thomas paced the ranch house floor while Ayanna labored in their bedroom, attended only by Mrs. Santos, who had arrived with her bag of traditional remedies and calm confidence. First babies take their time, Mrs. Santos assured him when he looked ready to panic. Your wife is strong. The child will come when it's ready. Just before dawn, as the storm was finally clearing, Thomas heard the sound he had been waiting for, a baby's first cry. Minutes later, Mrs. Santos emerged from the bedroom with a smile on her weathered face. You have a daughter, she announced, perfect in every way. Thomas entered the bedroom to find Ayanna exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Mrs. Santos's hand-woven blankets. The baby had a cap of dark hair and the most alert brown eyes he had ever seen. She's beautiful, Thomas whispered, hardly daring to touch something so precious. She's ours, Ayanna replied, and there was wonder in her voice as if she still couldn't quite believe it was real. They named her Rosa, for the desert roses that bloomed near the ranch house each spring. From the moment she was born, she seemed to embody the best of both worlds, her mother's quick intelligence and her father's stubborn determination. The first few months were challenging in ways they hadn't anticipated. Rosa was a fussy baby who seemed to sense the tension in her environment. She cried often and slept poorly, keeping both parents exhausted and worried. There were times when Thomas wondered if they had made the right choice in staying. The turning point came when Rosa was 3 months old. A delegation from the reservation arrived at the ranch led by Ayanna's mother and grandmother. Thomas braced himself for another confrontation, but instead found something entirely different. We have come to see our granddaughter, Ayanna's mother said simply. The visit that followed was awkward at first, with careful conversation and uncertain silences. But when Rosa was placed in her Apache grandmother's arms, something magical happened. The baby, who had been fussy all morning, immediately settled and fell asleep. She knows her blood, the old woman said with satisfaction. Apache children always recognize their family. Over the following weeks, Ayanna's mother began visiting regularly, bringing traditional foods and teaching Ayanna songs to sing to the baby. She also brought news from the reservation. Other mixed families were beginning to find acceptance, and the tribal council was slowly adapting to the reality of a changing world. Meanwhile, in town, Rosa's presence began to work its own kind of magic. When Thomas carried her to the general store, even the most hostile customers found it hard to maintain their anger. When faced with a beautiful, innocent baby who smiled at everyone she saw, Mrs. Patterson, the leader of the ladies' auxiliary, encountered them one day outside the post office. She had clearly intended to walk past without acknowledgement, but Rosa chose that moment to laugh at something only she could see, a sound so pure and joyful that it stopped the older woman in her tracks. She's quite beautiful, Mrs. Patterson admitted grudgingly. Thank you, Thomas replied politely. We think so. It wasn't friendship, but it was a crack in the wall of hostility they had faced for so long. The ranch began to prosper as well. The water management system Ayanna had designed was working better than anyone had hoped, and their cattle were among the healthiest in the region. Other ranchers began asking for advice, and Thomas started charging consultation fees for Ayanna's expertise. More importantly, they began to attract workers who didn't care about the color of their employer's skin. A young Mexican man named Diego joined them after being turned away from other ranches for his accent. 2 Apache men from the reservation, encouraged by Ayanna's success, asked for work during cattle season. Even a white drifter named Sam, scarred by his own difficult past, found a place with them. We're building something different here, Thomas observed one evening as they watched their diverse crew work together around the corral. Not white, not Apache, not Mexican, but something new. Maybe that's what America is supposed to be, Ayanna replied. A place where people can become something new together. The real test of their acceptance came when Rosa was 6 months old. The territorial governor visited Riverside as part of a tour of Arizona settlements, and a reception was planned in his honor. To everyone's surprise, including their own, Thomas and Ayanna received an invitation. They debated for days whether to attend. It would be their most public appearance as a family, and they couldn't predict how the community would react. "We could stay home," Thomas suggested. "Avoid the risk. Or we could go and show everyone that we're not hiding anymore," Ayanna countered. "That we're proud of what we've built." They decided to go. The evening of the reception, Ayanna wore her best dress and carried Rosa in a beautiful cradle board that her grandmother had made. Thomas wore his only suit, brushed and pressed for the occasion. Together they walked into the community hall where most of Riverside's prominent citizens had gathered. The reaction was everything they had feared and hoped for. Some people stared openly, others whispered behind their hands, but others greeted them politely, and a few even complimented the baby. The governor himself, a pragmatic man more interested in economic development than racial politics, made a point of speaking with them. "I understand you've developed some innovative ranching techniques," he said to Ayanna. "The Territorial Agricultural Office is always interested in methods that work in our challenging climate." By the end of the evening, they had survived their most public test. More than survived, they had proven that they belonged in this community, not as curiosities or outsiders, but as contributing members. A year later, as Rosa took her first wobbling steps across the ranch house floor, Thomas and Ayanna reflected on how far they had come. The ranch was profitable. They had friends from 3 different cultures, and their daughter was growing up surrounded by love and acceptance. But perhaps the most important change was in Ayanna herself. One morning, as she was getting ready for a trip to town, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. For the first time in years, she really looked at her reflection, not avoiding the scar, not focusing on it, but seeing her face as a whole. The scar was still there, would always be there. But it was no longer the defining feature she saw. Instead, she saw a woman who had fought for what she wanted, who had built a life based on love rather than fear, who had proven that courage could overcome prejudice. She touched the scar gently, remembering her grandmother's words from so long ago. "No man will ever want a woman marked by the spirit's anger." But her grandmother had been wrong. Thomas hadn't just wanted her despite her scar. He had loved her because of everything the scar represented. Her courage, her willingness to sacrifice for others, her strength in the face of adversity.